Welcome to the CSIS webinar, The Mexican Economy and its Impact on Migration. I am Mariana Campero, former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI, and a non-resident senior associate at CSIS. We are gathered here today with two leading experts to talk about how a serious contraction of the Mexican economy could modify stable migration trends towards the United States. I would like to thank Margarita Seminario, head of the Americas program at CSIS, for making all of this happen. As most of you know, past downturns in Mexico, like the one in the 80s or the 90s, have coincided with greater violence and an increase in migration to the United States. Today, Mexico's homicide rate is at an all-time high, and the Mexican economy has contracted for 4 consecutive quarters for the first time in a decade. In addition, the appearance of the coronavirus has impacted Mexico's main economic pillars. Thus far, the Mexican government's response has been minimal. Of all the countries in Latin America, only the Bahamas is spending less as a percentage of its GDP to support households and business during this crisis. To talk about the likelihood and the potential consequences of this, that it is a great privilege for me to introduce our two speakers. First, I will introduce Dr. Santiago Levy, an economist and the Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank from 2008 until 2018. Previously, he held numerous positions in government, including finance undersecretary during the Mexico tequila crisis and its aftermath. He was also the general director of the Mexican Social Security Institute, president of the Competition Commission, among others. Dr. Levy is a non-resident fellow at Brookings, and recently he has urged the Mexican government to act quickly in order to avoid harsher economic pains. Dr. Levy, thank you very much for being with us today. It is also an honor for me to introduce Dr. Andrew Seeley, president of the Migration Policy Institute and the founder of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He is also a prolific writer and an expert on global migration, with a special emphasis on the immigration policies in Latin America and in the United States. His most recent book, Vanishing Frontiers, speaks about the forces driving Mexico and the United States together. Dr. Seeley has also led various efforts to analyze regional migration flows among the Central America, Mexico, and the United States. He writes a column for El Universal newspaper in Mexico, and publishes opinion pieces regularly in the US press, including recent pieces in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the Americas Quarterly. Dr. Seeley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our agenda for today will consist on a 20-minute presentation by each of our speakers, followed by a Q&A session with the audience. If anyone has a question, I encourage you to fill out the form on the event page, and I will direct your questions directly to our panelists. We will be closing at 2 o'clock sharply. Dr. Levy, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon, and let me begin by thanking the Center for Strategic International Studies, and in particular, Mariana Campero, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to share the session with Andrew Seeley, a friend of many years. So as Mariana mentioned, I'll probably use 20 minutes or so to give first a little bit of background as to what has been happening in Mexico prior to the current government, then some concepts on the current government, and then to speak a little bit about the current situation as a result of the coronavirus. So when you think about Mexico, particularly when you think about Mexico from an American perspective, you have in mind NAFTA, but you also have in mind light migration, and you also have in mind the crime problem. And this gives you a flavor that it's a shade. Mexico is a mix of very different performances, and it's difficult to get a single straight story. Mexico, after 94-95, stabilized quite successfully its economy. As a result of NAFTA, it integrated very successfully into the world, with both the United States and Canada, but more broadly with Europe and the world. And by many was seen as a successful example of how countries stabilize and participate in the global economy. Mexico also invested a lot in education, and Mexico also invested a lot in raising its investment rate. So you would expect that a country that has macroeconomic stabilization, it's integrated into the world economy, has invested in education, and has also increased investment rate, would actually be a country that is doing very well. And the paradoxical thing is that Mexico's growth performance since NAFTA, even before the beginning of this administration, was a very mediocre growth performance. In fact, Mexico was among the countries of Latin America that grew the least. Yes, Mexico managed to increase exports tremendously. And in fact, Mexico exports more manufactured goods than all of Latin America put together. And we participate in some sectors that are fairly elaborate, like auto parts and aeronautics. But despite all that, our growth of GDP per capita has been less than 1% over the last 20 years on average. So it really is a very disappointing performance. And this disappointing performance is also reflected in the fact that Mexico's social standards have improved, but not as much as everybody would expect. Yes, there was a fall in poverty in Mexico, particularly associated with important new poverty programs that were launched a few years ago, and an expansion in pensions and other social programs. But still, the level of poverty in Mexico stagnated now at around 25% of the population. And aside from poverty, Mexico continues to be a very unequal country, a country in which the distribution of income is actually very concentrated at the top, and despite efforts to improve the distribution of income, hasn't really improved. So you have integration into the world economy, successful macroeconomic stabilization, accompanied with fairly mediocre growth performance, persistent inequality, and somewhat high poverty. And it's reflected in a phenomenon that is difficult to understand from an American perspective, but is very relevant from a Mexican perspective, which is that more than half of the labor force in Mexico participate in the informal sector, don't really have a job in which they have access to health and pensions and social security and various forms of insurance. So behind this, and I won't go into this because there's no time, is a huge productivity problem. Mexico doesn't grow because its aggregate productivity has not been growing. This is all background to what happened in the administration prior to López Obrador, which was the administration of President Peña Nieto. If we roll back the clock 6 years ago, and you read the press on Mexico 6 years ago, there was a tremendous excitement that Mexico was finally going to grow again very quickly, because at the beginning of the previous administration under President Peña Nieto, some, by the standards of that time, large reforms were carried out that were actually a source of a lot of excitement, and many people thought we're going to allow Mexico to become a more equal society and to grow faster. And two of them are very important to understand what is happening under the López Obrador administration. One was a reform in the energy sector, which for a long time was captured by public monopolies. Pretty much everybody has heard of Pemex, which is a monopoly in the oil extraction and refining sector, but there was also another monopoly in electricity, in the distribution, generation, and transmission of electricity. For a long time, this has been a very ideologically charged sector in Mexico for historical reasons. And during the previous administration, there was a major reform that allowed direct foreign investment into these areas. The second big reform was a reform of the educational sector, in which large public sector unions had for a long time had a lot of power about the quality of education And many people interpreted this as the reason why the quality of education in Mexico was low. These reforms in energy and education gave people the perception that this was now going to put path into a Mexico of higher growth and less inequality. And that was a lot the external perception. But the internal perception in Mexico was partly that, but it was partly also of a previous administration that was characterized by high levels of corruption, a lot of impunity, and the inability to stop crime and solve the issues of public security, partly associated with drug trafficking and drug gangs, but also associated most generally with the deterioration of public security. So towards the end of the previous administration, you had a country that since 95, since the tequila crisis of 94, 95, since the beginning of NAFTA, had experienced macroeconomic stabilization, but really no prosperity, and certainly no shared prosperity. And then you had an administration that was perceived to be corrupt, with a lot of impunity, and a growing issue of domestic security. And this provides a little bit the background for the elections that took place 2 years ago and resulted in the election of President López Obrador. As we all know, 2 years ago in July, there was an election in which President López Obrador was won as president. And this was a tremendous change in Mexico because, number one, he was clearly the winner with 53% of the votes. Secondly, everybody recognized that he was the winner. Thirdly, he won control of both houses of Congress. So as he entered office, he was the president that had the highest level of political legitimacy and probably the highest amount of power that a president has had in Mexico, probably over at least the last half century. President López Obrador is a mixed character and is sometimes described in the press as a populist president or sometimes described as a left-wing president. But it's not clear that these adjectives are really appropriate to describe our current president. One thing that should be noted is our president is a very fiscally conservative president. In the past, in the Latin American experience, a lot of sort of quote-unquote leftist presidents tried to do a lot of redistribution, increasing social programs and transferring resources to the poor by increasing spending, and very soon many of these regimes were having large budget deficits and large macroeconomic problems. But this is not what is happening in Mexico. President López Obrador is fiscally very conservative, even more conservative from the fiscal point of view than the previous administrations, because he has decided to have no additional debt. In fact, what he has done is he has done a huge austerity program within the government, cutting salaries, including his own, cutting expenditures for many other ministries, trying to lower corruption, and using all these resources to try to help the poor. So it is not your typical left-wing way of doing about it. In addition, the president has been respectful of the autonomy of the central bank, has been respectful of the flexible exchange rate regime, and was willing to renegotiate NAFTA with the United States and Canada and signed into law the revised version of NAFTA. I never really know the new name, has this complicated name, Mexico, Canada, something. But NAFTA 2.0 was signed by him. So 4 pillars of economic policy of the past: fiscal discipline, a flexible exchange rate regime, autonomy of the central bank, and integration into the world economy, particularly with Canada and the United States, are the same as before. It is sometimes spoken that Mexico is going a fourth transformation, but if you look at what is going on objectively, it is really nothing as big as that because core pillars are there. What has occurred is an increase in transfers to a subset of people. But this is really no different from what was going on before. It's just that the magnitude by which this is done has increased and some new programs introduced. The tradition of introducing new social programs in every administration has come in. What has made President López Obrador perhaps more controversial has been some decisions that he has taken about very visible infrastructure projects that have caused a lot of uncertainty with investors. A symbolic one was the airport in Mexico City, that he decided to cancel the project because he thought there was a lot of corruption and shift the airport to a different area. But also a couple of projects to develop the South, which is to build a refinery in the southern state, in which a lot of people claim it's not the right thing to do, and to build a train in the Yucatan Peninsula as a way of developing things in the South. That said, what is also, in my view, occurring with President López Obrador is that there's been some amount of institutional decay, an important concentration of power. Not only does he control both houses of Congress, but key institutions that have been built over the last 2 decades have been eroded as the people running those institutions were people that were much closer to the president. In that sense, President López Obrador is a view of the past of Mexico, perhaps of the 1880s, in the previous century, the 1980s, the 1970s, in which presidents concentrated a huge amount of power themselves, and there were no countervailing institutions like independent competitions commissions, independent energy regulations, independent regulations of telecommunications, all of that. The expectations would be that in this situation, economic performance would not be that much different from before. But the uncertainty caused by the investment decisions to make this refinery, recenter power in the presidency, caused a huge amount of uncertainty, and that uncertainty reflected in private investment declining in the course of the first year of his administration, that was 2019. And as a result of that, what was already very mediocre growth, and it's important to understand that we were not coming from paradise. What was already very mediocre growth came to zero. And during last year, despite growth in the US economy, Mexico actually grew zero. It was a slight minor fall. And relations between the president and the private sector were edgy in the sense that there was an understanding that cooperation was needed, but it was also some uncertainty as to whether the rules of the game were going to be respected, particularly as it concerned sectors in energy. One last point before I enter COVID. The president also rolled back some of the important reforms that were done in the previous administration, very importantly, the one on education, as he claimed that that reform was against the interest of the teachers. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, I'm just saying that's what he claimed, and much of the reform was rolled back. And in energy, he clearly signaled that even though formally the laws associated with energy investments were not going to be changed, de facto, it was going to be a complete new rule of the game. So Mexico perhaps could have chuckled along at 0%, 1% growth during this administration. As I said, no big changes, nothing spectacular, more uncertainty, less private investment, unclear results as to whether all these transfer programs were really going to be successful in reducing poverty, unclear results as to whether they're going to reduce inequality, and unclear results as to whether the security issue was going to be changed by the introduction of a national guard. Enter COVID. COVID changed things very quickly. And in the last 3 months, everybody is changing their expectations and adapting to a very different situation. Some claim, I would share that opinion, that the Mexican government was slow in reacting to the propagation of the virus, and that sanitary measures, lockdowns, and public opinion campaigns should have been much more aggressive earlier on to control the pandemic. And as a result, Mexico today is not yet at the point in which the number of infections is peaking as coming down, but infections in Mexico are still continuing while we're expecting to have an opening or a removal of the lockdown, gradual lockdown, over the next 2 weeks. I won't comment that much on the epidemiological dimension of this, unless there's some questions, but I will comment on something that Mariana touched on during her introduction, which is really quite relevant from what is going to happen next. The president has been unwilling to change his economic policy in response to the pandemic. While many countries in Latin America are trying to do countercyclical expenditure programs, in the language of the US, stimulus programs, to try to compensate for the economic crisis, like you did here in the United States with the CARES Act and other legislation that altogether has probably increased public spending by the equivalent of about 10% of GDP in the US, perhaps just a little bit more. And in the same way that Germany and Italy and countries in Europe and other countries in the world are doing programs to counteract the recession that is coming to Mexico, President López Obrador has decided that he doesn't want to increase indebtedness. He's a fiscally very conservative person and has barely increased social spending or programs to protect the poor in result of this crisis. The effect of this will be that the recession in Mexico in 2020 is going to be deeper than what it would otherwise have been, and the recovery in Mexico is going to take much longer than it was otherwise would have been. It was inevitable that in Mexico we would have a recession in 2020. Remember, the US is having a recession, the price of oil is coming down, exports to the US, to Canada are coming down, and in addition, the lockdown brings down domestic demand. So it was inevitable that we were going to have a recession. But to the extent that you can have a stimulus program to try to offset that partly, the recession could be shallower and shorter. This is not going to happen in Mexico. And in 2020, Mexico is going to have the biggest contraction in GDP since the 1930s. We're now on course to have a very large crisis, which is going to have very deep social cost, because as this crisis evolves, formal employment, which is the more productive employment in Mexico, is falling. We have already, during the months of April and May, lost over 1 million formal jobs, which is about 5% of all formal jobs in Mexico. It is expected that these trends will continue in the months ahead. And many informal workers whom the government required to stay home for the lockdown were never given the means of support. Nobody got a check for $1,200, of course, in the Mexican peso equivalent, but the figure is the idea that there was a support from the government. So many people are having a very hard time, and unfortunately, this is going to continue. Now, it's not obvious when this crisis is going to end, because as I mentioned before, infections in Mexico are still going up, and it is not clear how the crisis between the pandemic and the virus and the economic policy is going to interact. This context has now created a situation in which the private sector and the president are now at odds with each other, because many people, and as Mariana mentioned, I was one person who was also arguing in the same direction, were urging the administration to engage in countercyclical spending to protect formal workers and to protect informal workers and to mitigate the social cost of the crisis and to avoid bankruptcies of firms. But since this has not happened yet, there's now a tension between the private sector investors and the president. And as time goes by, this may deepen, depending or not whether there's a place to find some Congress in the ahead. So I don't want to take too much of the time because I think Andrew can give us a perspective from what's going to happened from the point of view perspective. But if I were going to describe Mexico, summarize it very briefly, then we're at a very critical juncture. The months ahead, things are going to get worse before they eventually get better. This might detonate a political dynamic that is difficult to control, and it is not clear whether the end result to this is going to be the ability to recover the path that we had prior to COVID-19. Let me stop here. Thank you, Mariana, and I'm ready for the questions. I think you're in mute, Mariana.
I think you're mute.
I am sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Seeley. I will now pass the floor to you, Andrew, if you would like to respond to that and tell us how do you think that sort of this economic impact will affect the past trends of migration toward Mexican migration towards the United States, and how will the United States, with your own realities, have the economic and political willingness to absorb new waves of migration?
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, and great to be with CSIS, America's program, and with Dr. Santiago Levy. Great to be with you again, Santiago. It's always hard to go after Santiago because he's so brilliant on these issues and lays things out so clearly and contundentemente. But this is, let me try and say a little bit on the migration side. I should say my only economic comment that I will make is there is a certain irony in the fact that you have a conservative government in the United States that is racking up debt to do stimulus in the middle of a crisis, and a government of the left in Mexico that has been incredibly austere during this crisis, as Dr. Levy was pointing out. So let me just point out that certain irony for those of us that watch both countries has been interesting to see that contrast. But let me stick to migration. One of the big questions is what's going to happen, as Mariana said. I mean, we don't know the answer. And there are two recent precedents. One is 1995 during the tequila crisis, where there was a huge migration from Mexico to the United States. It didn't happen all at once, but it began, or it reinforced a cycle that had already started in the 1980s, but it grew in the late 90s and the early 2000s. There was a moment where there were regularly over 1 million Mexican migrants crossing unauthorized, apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border every year. It reached about 1.6 million in 1 year. And clearly, economic crisis tied into a generator for migration. Now, it wasn't the only thing going on. There was a restructuring of the Mexican economy going on that was broader than the economic crisis. And I would argue that probably part of what was going on was not merely the effects of the crisis, but it was a restructuring of the economy, and there was a certain inertia built into the process once the migration began. We then saw a drop in Mexican migration starting in 2007, despite the fact that in 2008, 2009, the Mexican economy took an enormous hit during the global mortgage crisis, right? During the global recession, which started with the U.S. mortgage crisis for Mexico. An enormously deep crisis for Mexico, big recession, and yet we did not see an increase in Mexicans. That's exactly when Mexican migration began to go down and continued to go down, even despite the fact that it took a long time for Mexico to recover. So one of the questions that's worth asking, and I'll come back to this at the end, is are we looking at 1995, where a crisis detonates a migration flow, or at least pushes along a migration flow that already exists? Or are we looking at 2008, where the migration flow does not really change, despite the fact that things were worse in Mexico than they were on the U.S. side? But we'll come back to that in a minute. We are right now in a moment of extremely low migration from Mexico for reasons, despite all the things that did not go well in Mexico, despite slow growth, despite the fact that social programs have expanded slowly. You still have seen over the last 20 years an expansion of a social safety net in Mexico. Slight, insufficient, whatever you want, but if you want to look at education and good healthcare, you can question quality, but there's certainly an expansion since the late 1990s up until today of what existed, an expansion of infrastructure and a slow growth of income. That's part of the reason why you saw the number of Mexicans who are trying to cross the border unauthorized go down in this period. The other reasons, and in fact, not only did the number of unauthorized go down, but you actually saw the net number of Mexicans living in the United States went down from 11.7 million in 2010 to 11.3 million in 2017. That may not sound like much of a jump. It's 400,000 fewer Mexicans in the US, but the reality is Mexicans continue to arrive more through legal channels than through illegal channels in these years, although people arrived through both. But you actually had more Mexicans going back to Mexico than Mexicans coming to the United States. So this is a period where there has been a fairly significant drop in Mexican migration, in part because things are better in Mexico. But there's one other thing going on also, and that's been a huge expansion of temporary worker programs. Excuse me for a second, we deal with children. Elena, ¿me dejas hablar, por favor? Can you let me talk? We've seen a huge expansion of guest worker programs, primarily the agriculture H-2A program, as well as the service worker H-2B program in this period. And there are probably somewhere close to 300 to 400,000 Mexicans that come on temporary work permits to the United States. And if you come on professional, on the TN visa as well, a smaller number, but important number. So what we've seen is actually a large expansion of labor mobility, temporary labor mobility for Mexicans, which may have absorbed some part of those who wanted to migrate illegally in a different moment or would have been willing to make the journey in an unauthorized way across the border. So these two things have been happening at the same time, and we've seen a drop in Mexicans. At the same time, we've seen a very, very large increase in... Elena, ¿me das chance? No, ayúdame. Con mamá, por favor. Come on. So we've seen at the same time. Excuse me. This is the joys of living in a virtual world in isolation. So family and work bleed in together. You've at the same time, so you've had both of these things happening. At the same time, we've seen a huge increase in the number of Central Americans wanting to get to the United States through Mexico. And this started to increase in 2012. There were always Central Americans coming through, certainly Salvadorans in large numbers, Guatemalans less, Hondurans much less, but and Nicaraguans in much smaller numbers as well. But the numbers start going up in 2012, and particularly after 2014. And last year in 2019, we see the largest number of Central Americans trying to get in the United States, if we look at apprehension numbers, which are the best proxy we have for these things. They're not a perfect proxy, but they're the only proxy we have. So we saw a very large number, up to about 130, 140,000 people of all nationalities apprehended in 1 month in May of last year. Majority of those Central Americans, smaller number of Mexicans, smaller number of people from other countries, because we also start seeing Haitians and Cubans, Cameroonians, Congolese, and others coming through with this flow as well. We have now seen a huge drop, and that's largely until March, until we see the beginnings of COVID. I would have said this has primarily been a drop that was about U.S. policy responses. However, the U.S. government started a series of interlocking policies that have made it particularly hard for people to get into the United States. So we actually saw first the U.S. government starting the Migrant Protection Protocol, MPP, what some people call Remain in Mexico, where people who are apprehended from third countries are sent back to Mexico to wait for their asylum or other immigration hearings in Mexico. That was significantly expanded after June of last year when U.S. and Mexican governments reached an agreement around migration. We saw a huge increase in Mexican enforcement also at the southern and northern borders. We saw the U.S. government later imposing an asylum transit ban that said that anyone who came through a third country, i.e. Mexico, could not apply for asylum in the United States. And we've seen some efforts to speed up processing of people, HARP and PACER and others we can talk about later. And then finally, agreements with the Central American countries, primarily Guatemala so far, but beginning now with Honduras and El Salvador, to send people to those countries to process their asylum claims. As a result of all of this, we've seen a huge drop since May of last year until now of the number of people trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border illegally. And so those numbers have gone way down. What happened in March and April, obviously, is in addition to this, we had I think we're now alone here. That in addition to this, we had COVID hit in late March and then in April. And so the numbers went down in March simply because of the interlocking measures, and in February. And I mean, generally since September, we've seen fairly low numbers. But in April, we saw the lowest numbers we've seen in many years, 15,000 total apprehensions. And the U.S. did one more thing in terms of policy in the middle of the COVID crisis, which is it used CDC authority to expel people through an expedited process to Mexico. And the Mexican government agreed to take back Mexicans and Central Americans, but not others. And so now you can actually, the U.S. government is able to send people back within an hour or two to Mexico. Between that expedited process, which was justified by COVID, and the second thing going on, which Santiago talked about, which is the fact that there's simply, people are out of work, not just in Mexico, but in the United States. So the wage magnet began to dry up. And so people were thinking about migrating, were starting to get signals saying, look, please don't come now. Whoever you were going to stay with you when you arrive, saying, please don't come now because I'm out of a job. I can't hook you up right now. I'm trying to figure out my own situation. Between those things, we saw a huge drop. So it was about 15,000 apprehensions, about 140,000 in May of last year, 15,000, just over 15,000 in the month of April. Of those, most of them, 91%, were expulsions under the CDC order. So longer term scenarios, I think we're likely to see low unauthorized migration for a while. And the reason is the jobs magnet has dried up. Even for people who are fleeing for their lives, they're more likely to move within their home country than move to the US if they think they can't get a job, right? I mean, it is terrible to live. It's terrible to be in Mexico or El Salvador or wherever you were from without a job, but you will survive with your family network. It is almost impossible to survive if you suddenly move as a new migrant to the United States. And those you are planning to live with will tell you not to come. So there will be a period here where we're likely to see low unauthorized migration. And not only that, we're going to see people returning. I mean, we are seeing this now, actually, as people return back. We're also going to see a drop in remittances. There's contradictory information on remittances to Mexico, actually. But it's a good assumption that given the number of people who are recent immigrants, and in fact, immigrants in general, my colleague Julia Gillard has run some of the numbers on immigrants who are vulnerable to unemployment. There's a large number of immigrants, especially recent immigrants, but of all lengths of stay, who are unemployed in the United States. And so remittances are likely to go down as well, which is going to be a huge blow to families in Mexico and Central America. But they're going to have to deal with it. That could in another moment lead to people to migrate. But at this moment, they're still going to hunker down and stay home for the most part. Now, this may change. The one scenario is, if, as Dr. Levy said, that we have a long-term downturn in Mexico, and Mexico does not begin to reignite its economy, even when the U.S. economy begins to reignite at some point in the future. And I'm not predicting when that will happen, by the way, but at some point in the future, the U.S. economy may begin to get going again. It may be that some of these stimulus measures helped along the way. It's just was a strong economy beforehand. If you see the U.S. economy reigniting, unemployment coming down, and Mexico and Central American countries have not come back in the same way, then I think there is a question mark about whether you're going to start to see migration happen, and not merely from Central America, but from Mexico again. And some of us have said, after 10 years of low migration from Mexico, we're pretty sure that the age of Mexican migration is over. We all grew up with it. Pretty much any of us that is, are over 30 years old, we grew up with this idea that migration to the United States was primarily Mexicans because that was the biggest group. But that's no longer true. It hasn't been true for 10 years. The Mexican migration has actually been quite low. Well, and we've been saying, so the age of Mexican migration is over. That could change. There's at least a chance that you will see Mexicans beginning to migrate in larger numbers. We did see a slight uptick last year, but it was a minor uptick. What we could see is a major uptick. We could also see a major uptick from Central America. It's not going to happen in the short term, but it could happen in the medium to long term. Finally, there's some questions around legal migration. One of the things that we are, seeing with this administration is also a desire in a time of high unemployment in the United States to cut back on legal immigration. We saw a pause on some family-based green cards put on by the Trump administration a few weeks ago. It only applies to what we think is about 26,000 or so people a month, but that adds up over time. Many of those are Mexicans, by the way, who are a large number of those who solicit relatives living abroad. Not all, it applies to the whole world, but it does affect Mexico, certainly. And we could see other categories, employment categories, including service workers, probably not agricultural workers, but service workers affected by this, which would also have an impact on legal migration from Mexico. We don't know how this is all going to play out, but it's certainly something to be aware of. Let me finish with I think there's some clear dangers here. I think the biggest danger is that you will see the U.S. reactivate at some point, whereas the countries in the region really limp along for a long time, and that creates significant migration pressures. And you begin to have the pull factor of wages in the United States and employment in the U.S. with the factors that would drive people out of Mexico and Central America. I mean, both violence in Central America and parts of Mexico, but especially weak economic growth. There are some opportunities, however, and this is what I want to end with, which is, this is actually the time to think smartly about labor pathways. One of the things we should be thinking about now when there are fewer migration pressures is how do you begin to extend H-2A and H-2B to Central America? These have been almost exclusively Mexican programs, particularly H-2A. There are a few Guatemalans, but not many. So how do you begin to create some sort of labor pathway from Central America to the United States? Right now, you're not going to do it on a large scale, but is there any way, and there's been some attempt, I have to say the Trump administration has actually thought about this a bit. There's been some attempt to create some of the conditions in those countries in terms of certification to do this, but it's actually much more complex, and we can talk about that more if you want to create the actual pipeline where people begin to use this and it's easy for them to use it. Two, it's important to think about maintaining and humanizing and professionalizing enforcement. There could be migration pressures in the future. Mexico has done a lot of enforcement in the past year, but it's largely relies on its National Guard. That is probably not the best way to think about migration enforcement for the long term. So we should be thinking in both countries, if there are going to be migration pressures and there'll be pressures for enforcement, let's think about how we do this in a way that respects human dignity. And also, how do we begin to restore protection for people? I think it's going to be very hard. There's very narrow possibilities of applying for asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. But at a time of low migration pressures, this is actually the opportunity to begin to think of other protection mechanisms. And I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, but beginning to think about how we move protection closer to home where people are fleeing for their lives. We know that a certain percentage, and people disagree on whether it was a large number or minority of people, but there was a large number of people who had protection issues, who were fleeing from gangs, fleeing from local police, fleeing from other authorities, de facto or de jure authorities, in where they live. How do we begin to think of protection in country, protection in neighboring countries, alternate ways of identifying those in most danger before they leave, rather than at the moment they reach the U.S.-Mexico border? In a time of low migration pressures, though I think there are huge potential dangers ahead, there are also some real opportunities to actually be creative at this moment and do the kind of things that if there were to come major migration pressures a year from now or 6 months from now, we'd be in a much better place to handle it and create some escape valves and some protection valves that we actually need to have in place. And regardless of which administration is in place after January 20th, these are going to be important issues for our future. So thanks.
Dr. Seeley, thank you very much. And before I open the floor to question, I would just like to ask each one of you a question. I will start with Dr. Levy. Santiago, most financial institutions suspect that the Mexican economy will return to growth, even if it's a small growth, by 2021. Do you agree with these estimates? And if so, could you explain how, in a context in which the investors, both national and international, are uncertain about the permanence of the rules, the government is unwilling to take any additional debt or to change its spending priorities, and a global recessionary environment, where do you see the sources of growth coming from?
So thank you for the question. I don't see them. Maybe for statistical reasons, what you might see is growth in 2021. But if you're here and you come down sharply and then you sort of go from here, measure from the low point, you show a little bit of growth. So importantly, before COVID, Mexico was not growing. So once you eliminate these sort of recovery, these statistical issues, if you ask yourself the question, after the pandemic is controlled, why would it grow? And there's very little to give substance to that, to the answer to that. So best, we could, return to the sort of 0.5%, something like that we had before. Now, if the control of the pandemic does not occur, and we don't know this because this is a very difficult virus, if there are more outbursts here in the United States in the winter, and there's some more outbursts in Mexico too, then this situation of uncertainty might prolong itself, and this might spill over into 2021.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Dr. Seeley, remittances, you spoke a little bit about this, have fallen from the United States to other parts of Latin America. And contrary to most expectations, what we have seen is that an increase of remittances towards Mexico, and there might be some controversy towards that number. Could you explain what is behind this number, if it in fact is real? And what would you say is, as you know, remittances are key to supporting the poorest sectors of the Mexican population. And even AMLO is claiming some credit as to the increase of remittances, which is an irony. But what do you think is behind sort of these numbers of remittances?
Yeah, it's hard to know, and I'm not an expert on remittances. Manuel Orozco at the Inter-American Dialogue has been looking at these numbers. I know he's a little bit skeptical of this, and I think that there's different numbers that people are looking at that are going through wire transfers and through the banking system, and those that are going through physical transfer. And so there's some reason to doubt that the numbers are as fully accurate, or at least as giving us a full picture as we need to, and be just needing one more month. But let me venture a couple guesses. I mean, one thing is that probably people are trying to help their family members while they can. So those that are still employed may be remitting a little bit more, sending a little bit more money home to help cushion the crisis for their family in Mexico. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is you're seeing some people returning back to Mexico. And so people send their money before they go. So there may be some people sending one-time remittances of larger numbers of $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 that they've saved up before they go. And it could be, there is a possibility that the Mexican immigrant community has not been as hard hit as we expected, if only because so much of the Mexican community has been in the United States a very long time. Right. And so this is not a new immigrant community for the most part. There have been new Mexican immigrants arriving, but most Mexican immigrants have actually been in the United States for more than 10 or 15 years. And so this is, maybe an older community that's a little more entrenched, that maybe is slightly less vulnerable than some other more recent immigrant communities. So any of those are possible. I'm not sure, but I think we need another month at least before we get a sense of what the trend lines are. Almost certainly we are going to see some drop off of remittances. I mean, that there's just, given the unemployment figures in the United States, it's just hard to imagine that we're not going to see a very significant drop off. What we do know about previous waves is that often immigrants are hit very hard early on in recessions, but they also recover early on, right? They tend to be to have quite a bit of resilience, and partially is because they often work. Particularly recent immigrants tend to work, and this may not be Mexicans, but recent immigrants tend to work in areas of the economy that are much more fluid, right? The first to be laid off, but often the first to come back in, often switch work to find a new niche. Maybe it's less paid, but they'll find a new niche to be employed. So we'll have to just see, and some of my colleagues are monitoring this at MPI, so we'll see if that happens in this recession. But we can almost be certain there's going to be a period where there really is a loss of remittances. And remittances are one of the most pro-poor transfers that there is. I mean, it is one of the reasons why we saw a drop in one of several, but why we've seen an insufficient drop, but a drop in poverty in Mexico, and some reduction in the early 2000s of inequality. And so this hits families hard. And remittances are also, for many families, I mean, not only is it better food, is it better education, better healthcare, but it's often also their form of insurance, right? I mean, people like having a relative abroad because it increases their ability to consume, their ability to be educated, their ability to invest. But also it's an insurance plan for many families, right? I mean, people get laid off, people get a major illness. Having someone abroad is your insurance against that downturn. Right now, that insurance is lost. And so people are doubly vulnerable in Mexico, who are depending on income from someone in the U.S. who's also unemployed.
Dr. Levy, this is just a follow-up question from Linnea Sandin, Associate Director and Associate Fellow of the CSIS Americas program. If remittances do fall, what would be the impact on the Mexican economy?
There's not much that I can add to what Andrew already said. Just a point here. Remember that the peso-dollar exchange rate changed importantly over the last 2-3 months. So the peso value of dollar remittances has increased. So you might have fewer dollars being sent from the US to Mexico, but families receiving more pesos because the exchange rate changed. So that might be a short-run factor playing into it. From the macroeconomic point of view, remittances are not that large to make any significant change in terms of the growth rate of the economy or the performance of the economy. They're not that relevant. But for those households, individual households in some states for whom remittances are a source of income, if there was a permanent drop in remittances, this would add to the pain that these households are already having because the economy is in a deep recession and will probably have a long time before it fully recovers. So that would be very bad news for them as well.
There's another question. The investor unfriendly policies of this administration have already discouraged investment, both national and international. This, at the same time, has hampered Mexico's ability to take advantage of the supply chain readjustment that is occurring around the world. In the best of circumstances, do you see this will only be a wasted opportunity for Mexico? Or will this mismanagement and ideology will cause a lost decade for Mexico?
I would probably distinguish between the energy sector and on other sectors of the economy. Economic policy in the energy sector in Mexico has a very strong ideological and political context. For historical reasons of things that happened 90 years ago or 80 some years ago during the period of nationalization of oil, which for some people in Mexico still carries a huge amount of political weight. So I would distinguish the energy sector from all other sectors. I don't expect any changes in the energy sector. In fact, what has just recently happened to try to discourage investments in renewable sources of energy is actually yet another step in the path that I think this administration has of recapturing de facto, if not de jure, complete control over the energy sector. In other sectors of the economy, I would expect much more pragmatic policymaking, but pragmatic in both ways, not a rules-based. Pragmatic in the sense there's no big issue in auto parts, in electronics, in aeronautics, and all that. But if here and there's some investment that is disliked for whatever reason, like the beer plant in
the Constellation brands,
then that might go the other way. That's not really so much a big, heavy, ideological, deeply historical roots kind of policy making. This is more like kind of opportunistic, pragmatic. From the point of view of the investor, this is a very unhappy circumstance because you never know whether you're going to be that particular idiosyncratic risk or you're going to go with the others. Maybe this recession will actually induce the administration, energy sector aside, to be much more rules-based and much more welcoming to investment across the board. And yes, the potential for taking advantage of changes in value chains across the world as COVID changes supply chains could be there. But at this stage right now, I would say it's unclear.
Perfect. Dr. Levy, you've mentioned that one of the things that we have seen in this administration is a concentration of power. What do you think is the goal for concentrating all of that power?
So I think the president has a view of his administration as being, in a broad historical context, a transformative administration. He himself speaks of his government as Mexico's fourth transformation, one being independence, the other one being when we had the fight of independence against France, then the Mexican Revolution, and this would be the fourth transformation. So in his view, he does need to accumulate power to be able to go back to that Mexican state of the 1960s, which is a period of history that he associates with Mexico's development, in which a very, very strong executive power was able to impose order across society and its will across society for a mixed economy kind of development, but with a strong lead by the state, particularly in the energy sector. Whether that view and that model is compatible with Mexican society in the 2020s, with the links made with the rest of the world through financial markets, technological markets, and commercial markets, I think, in my personal view, it is not compatible. And you have to transit to an institutions-based and rules-based decision-making process rather than a process where you concentrate power. But in my interpretation, the reason why he's doing this is because he thinks that is what is required to go back to a period of history in Mexico 30, 40 years ago, in which Mexico was doing well compared to now.
Reality notwithstanding.
As I mentioned, it's not a view that I share, but I'm trying to just understand what is it that motivates.
Dr. Seeley, how do you see the political conditions in either the Republican or Democratic parties to absorb, or how do you think they would react with a potential new wave of migration, especially considering that we're having an election in November?
I think poorly in both cases, actually, and for slightly different reasons. This is, and by the way, let me add on what Santiago Levy said. I mean, I think also for López Obrador on the concentration of power, I think he has a perception, right or wrong, that there were a series of complicities between private and public actors, and that he is the honest mediator who's coming in, accumulating power to be able to break up those complicities. I think things are much more complex in the modern world than that description suggests, but I think it's part of his worldview. So I would just add it consistent with what Dr. Levy said. Yeah, I think new migration flow would be disastrous in different ways for either side. For Trump, this has been his signature issue. He has, bet his reputation on being able to bring particularly illegal immigration, unauthorized immigration down. And so if there is another spike as there was last year, it really speaks, to his inability to do this. And so it's certainly, whether it happens before the election or after the election, is something that challenges and his authority on an issue he's invested a lot of energy into. But it also actually would be fairly disastrous for President-elect Biden or President Biden, because the Democrats are also betting that they're able to do other things on immigration, that they're able to do things differently than President Trump has done them, and that won't generate a huge increase in migration, right? And that they are going to be able to do things like fixing DACA, like doing a permanent solution to those who have temporary relief under DACA, perhaps some other things on immigration. And this is not going to generate a huge flow of people to the border. Maybe restore protection at the border, some form of asylum at the border, some form of normal order that existed before. If they do any of that, and then there's a huge flow of people to the border, that's going to be a huge issue, right? I mean, that becomes then a major issue that will be perceived as a lack of control by President Biden or the Democrats. So I think both, this is an issue that has bedeviled Democrats and Republicans, different approaches, different ways of looking at this perhaps. But I think both are hoping that whatever happens in the future, the numbers are going to stay low. And both are looking, by the way, I think, for continued cooperation with Mexico. I mean, it's been very explicit in the case of President Trump, and it's certainly been done with a hard edge, threatening tariffs last year if Mexico didn't do more on enforcement. But I'd be very surprised if Vice President Biden were elected or become future president of the United States, if he also doesn't, perhaps in a more quiet way, communicate the same thing, which is we're expecting some sort of cooperation around this so numbers don't get up, but perhaps with some attempt to restore, protection, use of refugee program, maybe instead of asylum initially, look at labor pathways, maybe do some other things as well in addition to that hard edge. But I think both are betting on migration flows staying low.
We have come to the end of our program. Again, I want to thank our two panelists for their insights and their incredible presentations. Again, I would like to thank Margarita Seminario and the whole team at CSIS for helping us make this possible. Have a good afternoon, and thank you all of you for your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you.
Bye, Andrew. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.